This has been sort of a long-term side project goal for me. I wanted to see what Dominating Blow would look like at max gem level in modern PoE, and also maybe provide an updated build for it. I actually get somewhat frequent requests to update my old Dominating Blow Guardian guide, which is understandable since I did put a lot of work into making sure that guide was very thorough. Unfortunately, ever since the Guardian rework, I have felt like Dominating Blow doesn't really have a place in the modern meta of PoE. That hasn't really changed, but some of the new items and crafting options from this season actually gave me some motivation and inspiration to take another crack at building around the skill. Before I get too deep into this, I want to emphasize that I wouldn't particularly recommend this build as a first choice for basically anything in the game right now. But if you just really like the skill Dominating Blow like I do, then maybe you can take away some ideas from this video. So after mulling over which Ascendancy would work best for the skill now, I eventually decided to build this character on a champion. Guardian has no reason to use Dominating Blow over SRS, Summon Raging Spirit, and Necromancer doesn't have the defenses needed for such a melee playstyle. Scion was an option, but ultimately Champion won out because of its combination of defenses and supportive damage stats, and most importantly, a whole lot of aura effect. The new reworked War Banner takes a while to charge up, but it is very worth it as the damage potential it adds is just insane, and conveniently it scales with aura effect. Champion also provides Intimidate and Adrenaline, and makes it so the attacks from both you and your minions can't be evaded, meaning we can skip taking Resolute Technique on the skill tree. It only saves 1 point, but it's still something. But before we get into detail about how I built this character, let me show you how I was able to get Dominating Blow to gem level 40, which is the hard-coded gem level cap that can't be exceeded regardless of gem level modifiers. First, this league introduced a new boss with a new pair of gloves that give +3 to the level of all melee skill gems. As it happens, Dominating Blow is a melee skill gem. Then we have rune crafting. If you're familiar with my old guide, then you've already seen the type of war staff I use to boost the gem level. Well, now there is a rune craft that gives +2 to the level of socketed melee gems and can be crafted on a staff. Again, this also applies to Dominating Blow. This means it's possible to craft a +5 staff, then socket a level 4 empower into it for another +4 because of +1 gem levels on the staff, and get another +3 from our glove slot, another +3 from a replica Dragonfang's Flight, and +2 from a minion helmet. Awakened Melee Splash and Awakened Minion Damage also give +1 each. That's still only +19 though, and unfortunately a level 21 Val Domination gem costs about 35 Divine right now, and I probably wouldn't use Dominating Blow without Val Domination because it's just such a big upgrade to the skill. I've tried to make one at level 21 myself with Alva Temples, but after I failed 12 in a row I came up with a different solution. A level 20 Val Domination is actually pretty easy to get and only costs about 1 Divine, but I already had several of them from the attempt at getting a level 21, and the body armor Adziri's Splendor gives +1 to the level of all Val skill gems, and otherwise it's not bad stats-wise. So that finishes the +20 and brings us to the cap of a level 40 Dominating Blow gem. Is this worth it? No, absolutely not. Gem levels have a breakpoint at level 30 where they fall off and suffer massive diminishing returns from additional gem levels, so it would be much wiser to focus on getting to gem level 30 and then scaling your damage in other ways, but I wanted to reach the cap, and all the footage in this video is using this setup that I just explained. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let me get into more detail on how I actually built the character, starting with the passive tree. And right away, this is one of the reasons why I don't really recommend this, especially as a starter, is because Duelist has basically nothing to support minions in his area of the tree other than some banner effect nodes, which are nice, but they're not enough on their own. So this tree kind of heads straight towards the Templar area of the tree, which has a lot more minion support in it. You can see that in the Duelist area, all I really take here is some life, some attack speed here. This also gives a little bit of movement speed by ignoring the penalty from body armor. Some Mana Leech right here. This is actually very convenient because Mana Leech is something that this build used to need to get on its gear. because it just wasn't available on the tree before, but now it's in a very convenient spot for us, so we just take it on the way out of the duelist area. And this also gives us 12% mana reservation efficiency mastery. Take the jewel socket on the way down. This banner wheel is good, but I actually would not take this until later in the game. It is mainly for this mastery. For enemies near your banner take 8% increased damage. That is actually very strong. This notable here doesn't really do anything on its own. Then going down here, just pick up the mana reservation efficiency node, grab some life on the way, more life here, more life here. I would grab this jewel socket probably with my next 2 points. Then heading further up the tree, more life here, some staff block here, minion stuff here, another jewel socket, more life here, more staff block here. Divine Shield, this is just a pretty nice defensive node if you have decent physical mitigation, as well as a decent buffer of energy shield. Another jewel socket here, more minion stuff here, mana reservation, life, more staff block, more minion stuff here, and then some more life down here. So the entire tree is life, defenses, mainly block, and minion stats. Also, this node here, Spiritual Aid, this is very nice because it does increase your damage, and while your damage doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things in this build, because this is a minion build, you get your damage from your minions, you do need to kill at least one regular enemy to spawn the first minion, and then from there you can easily spawn the rest of your army, but you do need to be able to take down at least one regular enemy, so this is actually quite nice. You can see here my DPS tooltip is about 16,000. That is nothing significant, but it's enough to kill a regular enemy. And then there's this cluster jewel socket here. This is mainly for Blessed Rebirth. This means that your minions are all guaranteed to survive at least 4 seconds. And this is really important against especially certain endgame encounters that create degen areas on the ground, mainly things like Uber Elder and Maven. But again, I honestly don't really recommend this build for doing that content. This node, Life from Death, is also pretty nice. It actually makes your Spectres and Golem and Animate Guardian almost immortal while you're mapping, because they just keep getting healed every time you refresh your regular minion army. So this is really good for protecting your permanent minions. And actually, the minions recover 4% of life on minion death is a slightly weaker version of the minion defense mastery, where they recover 5% of life on minion death, but you also get the extra effects of this Life from Death notable, which are pretty decent. And then you don't need to spec into another minion defense wheel in order to get that recover effect, which is really, really nice. Because the minion defense mastery, you probably want it to be convocation cooldown, because this just makes the build feel much better. In this jewel socket, I have a Storm Shroud. This is basically the only reasonable way to get ailment immunity on a champion, by combining with a 50% chance to avoid being shocked Abyssal Jewel, and then putting that jewel in a perfect Darkness Enthroned. That gives a 100% chance to avoid being shocked, and then Storm Shroud turns that into a 100% chance to avoid all elemental ailments. Which is yet another reason that I can't recommend this as an early league build, because a perfect Darkness Enthroned is quite expensive. I think I bought this for 9 divine, 8 or 9, somewhere in that range. Next, going over the gems, and just starting with the main skill, Dominating Blow. There are actually quite a lot of options on what to link to it, but the setup I've gone with is Awakened Melee Splash, Empower, Awakened Brutality, Multi-Strike, and Awakened Minion Damage. This is definitely not the optimal setup for this. In fact, Empower is not even close to one of the best gems I can put in here, especially when I'm already so far over the breakpoint for diminishing returns on gem levels. But like I said earlier in the video, I just wanted to hit the cap of level 40. But there are a whole bunch of other gem options that would be good here. Other options would include melee physical damage, in particular Awakened melee physical damage. I don't use that because I don't like the slower attack speed. I think it just feels bad, but it is technically the #1 gem for damage. Predator support is very good for this. In Path of Building, it won't seem like it's very good until you actually select the gem, then go into the configuration tab and click the checkbox for enemies marked with signal prey, because that is where the damage on that gem actually comes from. Hypothermia is actually usable because the build gets chill from skitter bots. Impale is also an option, and then if you wanted to go a crit route, you could spec into more minion crit on the tree and go increased critical damage. Like I said, there's a bunch of different options here. You don't have to go with this exact gem setup that I've used here. In fact, I would say the only mandatory gems here other than Dominating Blow are Awakened Minion Damage, because this is probably the #1 damage support gem for the skill, and Multi-Strike because this just feels so much better than not having it. It is so much faster, and it's a very high damage gem. It's very efficient. And then if you're mapping, you want Melee Splash because it vastly improves the clear, and it might as well be Awakened Melee Splash because it's not very expensive. But with the other two gem sockets, you can basically do whatever you want. Awakened Brutality is nice because it provides Crush, which is actually pretty rare, and Crush reduces enemy physical damage reduction, which is very strong. So going down here, I have Leap Slam linked to Fast Attacks. This is just a mobility skill. I have Convocation here. If you want to, you could link this to Automation, or you can manually cast it, or you can do some keyboard shenanigans to automate it, but I'm not going to go into that here. And then here I just have Flesh and Stone. This is on its own outside of the main aura setup on the build because it's not a very expensive aura, so it doesn't need to be linked to Enlighten. Speaking of auras, I'm using Determination, Summon Skitterbots, Pride, and then Enlighten to make them cheaper. This is the exact same aura setup that I used on my old Guardian version of the build. Because I'm using a staff, that means I get a second 6-link setup, and this is the same idea as what I did in the Guardian version. I have my Animate Guardian and my Race Spectre in my 6-link. This means I can link them to Feeding Frenzy and Minion Life. I also have my Carrion Golem in here, and a Maim Support. Maim Support causes enemies to take increased damage when they're maimed by a supported skill. So it doesn't matter that this isn't linked to Dominating Blow, just as long as it's linked to something that can hit enemies, it will make your Dominating Blow minions deal more damage. Feeding Frenzy is similar in that it gives you a minion attack speed buff while it's active, and it doesn't matter where it comes from, and when it's linked to 3 different permanent minions, it's going to be active pretty much all of the time. And then Minion Life Support obviously is here just to help keep the Spectres and Animate Guardian alive more consistently. Optionally, you could drop one of these gems for a little more defense, maybe drop either the Carrion Golem or the Maim Support, and then add in either Meat Shield Support or Elemental Army, just for a little better defenses on the Spectres and Animate Guardian. And for the last few gems, Desecrate and Flesh Offering, I'm not automating this at all, because this is something that you only need to do once really on bosses, like once or twice just between phases. And you don't really need to worry about always being attacking with Dominating Blow, so you do get breathing room sometimes to just cast Desecrate into Flesh Offering and get a big attack speed buff on your minions. And finally, down here, I have War Banner linked to Awakened Generosity. I haven't even finished leveling Awakened Generosity yet. And War Banner, the amount of damage it adds if you look in the POB is just absolutely insane. Be aware, though, that it's pretty rare to actually reach max Valor on War Banner. At first, when I was planning this build, I was planning on taking all of the increased maximum Valor nodes and then just dropping a huge War Banner for just ridiculous damage. And then once I put it into practice, I realized, oh, it actually takes a long time to build up Valor, so it's not worth playing it in that way, but it's still worth running the skill. It is still a very efficient skill for extra damage. And you might notice that in all these gems, there is no guard skill. That's for 2 reasons. One is that it just takes a lot of gems to set up a minion build like this, and 2 is that this build is actually block capped and has pretty decent defenses against hits, but not against damage over time. And adding a guard skill wouldn't really change that. Guard skills only work against hits, and the build is already pretty tanky against hits, and they don't work against damage over time, which is the main weakness of the build right now. I think if I were to change anything on this build, I would either spec into some more life regeneration, or maybe try to fit a vitality aura into the build, or maybe even use tattoos to get life regeneration. I think that is the #1 thing I could fix on this build. So if you were looking to get some ideas from this video, that is probably the #1 sort of warning that I'd want you to take away, is that there's a life regen problem on this build, and it struggles against dots. Also, I mentioned one of the alternatives for gem supports for Dominating Blow would be Impale support, and that is something I used on the Guardian version, and I really sung the praises of it back then, talking about how good Impale is with Dominating Blow, and I still think it is pretty good. And in fact, when I was planning this build, I was planning around using Master of Metal to make the impales of my minions better, but the numbers on it are just pathetic. It is not worth running at all. I wish it were, but it's not. The numbers on this are just really, really low. It's absolutely not worth running Master of Metal. I wish that instead of the flat 6 to 12 added fizz per impale, it was something like increased impale effect, or just something that could actually scale into endgame, because this doesn't, not even close. The only nice thing on this is the impales you inflict the last one additional hit, which is useless for this build. So another way they could fix this is to say impales you and nearby allies inflict last one additional hit. That would make this actually very worth running, and probably you would definitely run impale if that were the case, but it's not, so it's not worth running. Actually, I just realized that I haven't even gone over the Ascendancy node, so real quick, first to strike, last to fall. This is actually the last thing I took, and it was what I took to replace Master of Metal. Your hits permanently intimidate enemies that are on full life. This is actually kind of rare because your minions are usually going to hit things before you. Fortunately, most Pinnacle bosses have a buffer of energy shield that your minions won't get through before you hit them, so you will get the permanent intimidate on big bosses, just not on like map bosses. The gain adrenaline for 20 seconds when you reach low life. This is really nice just because adrenaline is a really strong defensive buff. And then recover 25% of life when you gain adrenaline. Again, just a little heal, a little emergency heal. Remove all ailments and burning. Doesn't really mean anything because already ailment immune. It does remove bleed and poison, which is pretty nice. But other than that, the build is already elemental ailment immune. So this is probably the least important node on the tree. Over here is inspirational. This is mainly taken for 30% increased effective non-cursed auras. This is probably the most important overall. I don't know if this was the first one I took while leveling, but 30% aura effect is a lot. Conqueror, 100% chance to taunt on hit, 10% reduced damage taken if you've taunted an enemy. So this is just really nice defense. Like, it's just 10% reduced damage taken, basically, because you're always going to be taunting. And then that allows you to spec into Worthy Foe, which is actually the main reason you go through Conqueror. Enemies taunted by you take 20% increased damage, so that's pretty close to 20% more damage, and then enemies taunted by you cannot evade attacks. That includes your minions. So you don't need to take Resolute Technique, and you don't need to worry about minion accuracy. Your minions will always hit as long as the enemy is taunted by you. I've already explained most of the gear, so let me just go through it really quick. The staff I've already explained in detail. This is just to boost the gem level of the Dominating Blow, and then to get some attack speed and some minion damage. The gloves, this is a new unique, +3 to level of all melee skill gems, really nice. Darkness Enthroned, as I said, this is for ailment immunity primarily, and then you can just fit in whatever stats you need on your Abyssal Jewels. Adziri's Splendor, already explained, +1 to level of all Val skill gems. If I were to be making a more competent build that wasn't just built around the level 40 gem meme, I would probably use a Spore Guard here, the same way that I did in my old Guardian build. I was using a Spore Guard actually before I switched to this. Up here is a +2 to all minion skill gems helmet that just has some decent stats crafted on it, and then mana reservation, efficiency, and reduced mana cost. In the implicits, those are both Eldritch mods, and both very nice for the build. The way I was able to get the +2 to level of all minion skill gems and the 9% mana reservation efficiency from an essence onto the same item was actually with the Recombinator. It took quite a few attempts, and I don't really know if I would recommend doing it, but that is how I did this. I made helmets that had the essence mod, and I bought helmets that had the +2 minion mod, and I smashed them together with the Recombinator until I got something usable. Replica Dragonfang's Flight, this is already explained. This is pretty much the best amulet for this build now. It used to be Ashes of the Stars, but I think this has just become better now. Anointing, Enigmatic Defense, this gets us to the block cap. Not quite to spell block cap, but it does get to the attack block cap. If you were not so focused on block, you would either anoint Enduring Bond for minion damage and minion duration, or you would anoint Death Attunement for +1 Spectres. Right now, for my Spectres, I'm using a Carnage Chieftain and a Demon Harpy. These are the two best Spectres for Dominating Blow, for the physical version of the build anyway. If I were to add another Spectre, it would either be an Arena Master, which has an attack speed aura buff, or a Host Chieftain, which gives power charges to your minions. And then for a ring, I just bought a Fractured Curse Enemies with vulnerability on hit. I bought this pretty late in the league, so they were pretty cheap. I think I bought the Fracture for 3 or 4 Divine. Earlier in the league, this would be much more expensive, and then I just crafted on it. And I ended up hitting something pretty nice here, so this is a pretty nice ring. I wouldn't expect to get something quite this good. And then an Amethyst ring. This actually came in one of my boats, and it was crazy how good this ring was. It didn't have the life on it before, but I just hit this with an Exalted Orb, and I hit a decent life roll, and then crafted the negative mana cost for skills. And that's basically it for the gear. The only other thing for the gear would be jewels, and I'm just taking generic good defensive stats. Minion damage would also be decent on jewels. And if you were really rich and you really wanted to pump money into this build, by far the best defensive buff you could get to this build would be to buy the Forbidden Jewel combo for the Gladiator More Than Skill, which gives you Lucky Block, which is absolutely broken. But right now, I believe that combo on trade is about 80 Divine, so it is not cheap at all. And it still wouldn't solve the damage over time problem, the life regeneration problem that the build currently has. I think the only thing left to explain in the build really is the Animate Guardian setup. If you've watched my old guide, or if you've ever played a minion build that uses Animate Guardian, this will be a pretty familiar setup. It's using a Kingmaker for the weapon. This gives nearby allies 10 fortification. This means I don't need to take the champion Ascendancy fortification notable. Champion gets 15 from their Ascendancy, Kingmaker gives 10, so it's not really worth taking the Ascendancy node just to increase it by 5. For the body armor on the Animate Guardian, I'm using a Gruthkul's Pelt. This gives huge life regen to an Animate Guardian and keeps it alive through pretty much everything other than getting one shot by something huge like a Cirrus Meteor. Then for the boots, I just made some crafted boots with decent resist rolls, and then Eldritch crafted Brittle Ground while moving, and life regeneration rate because that combos pretty well with the Gruthkul's Pelt. The helmet on the Animate Guardian is a Leercast, just a generic 50% increased damage aura. For the gloves, I just used a Corrupted Southbound. Southbound has a percent increased life roll on the item, and then I used one that had an implicit percent increased life just to give the Animate Guardian as much life as possible, because you really don't want it dying and then you have to replace all of the gear on it. Again, if you are unfamiliar with Animate Guardian, I really recommend just watching a proper Animate Guardian guide. It is a very complicated skill, but if you've ever played a minion build with Animate Guardian, you should already be pretty familiar with similar setups to this. Just to finish off this video, I just want to go over some of the main differences between this and the Guardian version if you ever followed my old build guide. As I said several times in this video, this probably isn't a good league starter. It needs significantly more expensive gear than the Guardian version, and the Guardian version was something that I really liked specifically as a league starter. This probably has higher damage potential, but it does lack the huge HP regen from Guardian, and as I've said, that lack of regen is like the biggest weakness of the build right now. It is really vulnerable to dots. I mentioned it already, but just because it is a difference from the Guardian version, this build does have the very expensive option of using the Forbidden Jewels to get More Than Skill for Lucky Block, but again, currently 80 Divine. Maybe there are better things to spend your currency on, and it still won't solve the regen problem. And as I mentioned in the gem section, this build is not as heavily based on Impale like the Guardian version was. Probably the main reason for that change is that Dread Banner no longer has any sort of Impale aura effect. There's no way anymore to scale Impale on nearby allies, so it's just a lot harder to scale the build in that way. But there are lots of other gem options, and actually I remembered one that I didn't mention while going over gems, and that is Fresh Meat support, which gives your minions a huge buff to crit and crit damage and gives them adrenaline for 10% of their duration, which on Dominating Blow I think is 2 seconds. I think they last 20 seconds by default. Yes, they last 20 seconds. You can increase the duration. So that would be 2 seconds where your minions would be super buff when they come out, and it's kind of worth it, kind of not. Overall, probably not worth it, but if your minions are dying all the time or if you're constantly refreshing them, it can be worth it, but there are just more consistent options for gems, so I don't really like it that much. I was really excited for it when it came out, but it just doesn't last long enough. And the last difference is one that I've already mentioned. Again, there is no guard skill. There's no cast when damage taken Molten Shell like there was on the Guardian version. Again, the character is block capped against attacks. At least it is getting close against spells, but not quite there. So not having a guard skill is not the worst thing in the world, especially since they only defend against hits, and this build is already pretty tanky against hits, although it could use some more chaos resist. Probably the way to fix that would be with the Light of Meaning jewel with a chaos resistance version. So anyway, there is my take on Dominating Blow in 3.25. Like I said, I wouldn't really recommend it as a first choice for basically anything. I think that in the current state of the game, for a build to really be viable, it should be able to at least do either tier 17 maps, Forbidden Sanctum, Uber bosses, or Delve. At least one of those. And Delve is hanging on there a little precariously. Delve is also probably the only one of those that this build can competently do. Other than that, you would probably be relegated to tier 16 farming on this build, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but you could certainly do better. I'll leave a link to the POB in the description. Maybe this video will have given you some ideas to improve on it if you want to try it out. Anyway, thank you for watching.